Hello, I'm Tim Peacock, a volunteer at Pendon Museum. This episode of Views of the Vale concludes a series during which we have visited most of the buildings modelled at Pendon. It's fitting that this episode is about the village of Bishopstone, which was both one of Pendon founders Roy England's favourite locations in the Vale and also his final resting place. Bishopstone village is one of a number of springline settlements that we have visited in this series. It sits astride the road between Womburgh and Ashbury, called the Icknield Way, and links the line of settlements along the bottom of the chalk escarpment. As with many of the places we have visited in this collection, Bishopstone was a thriving farming community, but this activity has declined in the last 50 years or so. Today, the village comprises about 150 dwellings with a population of around 300. The parish includes the village of Hinton Parva, and it's there that our tour begins.
Halfway between Bishopstone and Womburgh lies the delightful village of Hinton Parva, or Little Hinton. The Hinton Village Hall was once a school, and is modelled at Pendon as one of the two schools set in the heart of the village in the Vale scene. In 1821 the land here was gifted to the parish, and a cottage built to serve as a school for up to 30 pupils. In 1848 the cottage was enlarged and a new schoolroom added with lancet windows. The school closed in 1927 because of a decline in the number of local children, an indication of the changing economic and social circumstances of rural communities in this area. In this photograph from 1930, the school building is on the left, immediately behind a brand new public telephone kiosk, as they were called in those days. The school was constructed in a mix of dressed limestone with random limestone bricks and chalkstone forming the remainder of the structure. Part of the building was rendered at some stage in the Pendon period, and the whole building treated with a lime wash which had begun to peel away by the time Roy England recorded the building in the 1950s. The building became the village hall in 1976, prior to which it was residential accommodation for a number of years. This was the first school modelled for the Vale scene. However, as the project developed, it became clear that an additional school should be added, and this was based on Snell's Hall in East Hendred, which is covered in another episode of this series. At Pendon, the two schools are located next to each other with a shared playground. The village of Bishopstone dates from at least the 6th century, although there are signs of earlier occupation, such as the remains of two Roman villas and evidence of Bronze and Iron Age activity. Today, the village has a population of about 700. There is a distinctive mill pond at the centre of the village. In the book Villages of the White Horse, published in 1913, the Wiltshire writer Alfred Williams rated Bishopstone the prettiest of all the Ridgeway villages, a view with which Pendon's founder Roy England very much concurred. Several buildings in Bishopstone are already part of the Pendon Vale scene or are currently being modelled. These include the Church of St Mary's, 3 cottages in the city, and 3 cottages in the High Street. Lilac Cottage was probably built in the late 17th century, before the introduction of the window tax in 1696. Significant additional tax was levied if a house had 10 or more windows. So to avoid this, one of Lilac Cottage's 10 windows was bricked up, a common feature of older houses in England even today. The cottage is constructed from chalk rubble on a hard stone base, and its appearance today is almost identical to how it looked in the 1930s. The model of Lilac Cottage is ready for installation in the Vale scene. About 100 yards further along the High Street, away from the centre of the village, are 2 attached cottages modelled at Pendon. The first is called Edmund's. Its neighbour, now called Littlecott, was known in the 1930s as Blissett's and retains this name in the Pendon model. They are 18th century or earlier thatched cottages with walls of dressed and coursed chalk rubble on sarsen plinths. Photographs of both cottages were taken during Pendon research. Littlecott was extended in the mid-19th century with brick quoins. In the interior, smoke-blackened beams suggest that it may have originally been a medieval open hall house. Some surviving straw rope and woven wattle under the thatch also indicate that the roof structure may predate the 18th century. In late 2021, modelling of Edmonds and Blissett's was underway, this mock-up of the model having first been built to confirm the accuracy of the Pendon survey. In the Pendon diorama, all three Bishopstone High Street cottages will be located close together, between St Mary's Church and Pendon Manor. The area of Bishopstone known as the City is a group of cottages in a spectacular setting. The cottages are built around a spring, called William's Well, which until 1932 provided much of the water for the village and was the basis for watercress cultivation. A thriving watercress industry developed during and after the 1840s, when the Great Western Railway provided a timely way to get the produce to market. This photograph shows the setting as it was in 1956, by which time cress production in the village was of less importance. The approach to the city is only by footpath, which must have made construction of the cottages something of a challenge, and which continues to make maintenance difficult to this day. The city is centred on Spring Cottage, which dates from the 18th century and was originally two dwellings, but is now a single dwelling that has been much enlarged since the 1930s. The walls are made of cob, a building material that comprises subsoil, straw, water and lime. Cob walls are laid in courses, each one being left to dry completely before the next one is laid. The building was first photographed and surveyed by Pendon in the early 1950s and again in 1972. Roy England modelled the cottage in its natural setting between the cress beds and rising ground, producing this model of Spring Cottage in 1979. Finch Hill Cottage is to the left of Spring Cottage and is an early 19th century L-shaped building that was also first surveyed in the 1950s. It has chalkstone walls with a thatched roof. At Pendon, as in reality, it is placed next to Spring Cottage. Lincott, to the right of Spring Cottage, is joined to Macy's Cottage, but the latter is not included in the Vale scene. An extension on the left-hand end of Lincott has an extra wide door. It's believed that this was added to make possible the entry of large animals such as horses and cattle for veterinary treatment. The wicker baskets in front of the cottage were used for collecting the watercress. At Pendon, the model of Lincott is called Oldcott. The Church of St Mary the Virgin is the final stop in this last episode of Views of the Vale. St Mary's Church is listed in Grade 1. It was built in the 13th century with a large cross-shaped plan and a perpendicular Gothic central tower. Of particular note is an ornate late Norman doorway on the north side. The presence of a parapet on the south side of the church is a distinctive and unusual feature. There are also said to be shot marks in the walls from musket fire in the Civil War. At Pendon, the model of the church is currently a mock-up that was made to check the sight lines for the other buildings around the church. Work is underway on modelling the church windows and the parapet. The complexity of both their outline and profile makes modelling them accurately especially challenging. The windows are created using a computer-aided design system, building each window as a series of separate layers that, when assembled, creates the required shape. The layers are cut using a laser to provide precise shapes that capture the fine detail, as shown here for the large west window. There are some 30 windows and door cases in the building, with the most complex designs requiring up to 5 layers. It's especially fitting that Pendon should be using new techniques to produce the most accurate model possible of this particular building.
I'm outside the church, near to a memorial plaque to Pendon's founder Roy England. It marks where his ashes were interred in 1995. Most, if not all, of the buildings we have visited were selected and many of them researched and photographed by Roy. At Pendon, they are located in an imaginary scene that was largely conceived by him. We think this is a fitting place to conclude Views of the Vale. Our aim in producing Views of the Vale has been to provide the many people interested in Pendon with a way to enjoy a virtual exploration of the Vale of White Horse, and in particular the buildings that are modelled at the museum. We started out intending simply to focus on buildings that were visited in the various Skylark tours that took place a few years ago. But we think we have ended up with a much more comprehensive exploration than any one day out could possibly achieve. I'd like to reflect briefly on what we have seen. We have visited around 60 buildings and other structures, comparing them where we can with how they were around 1930 and how they are modelled at Pendon. A 1930s resident of the Vale would probably recognise many of these buildings today. We need to remember that this is in no small part due to the considerable efforts of people like John Betchman, an Uffington resident, in helping to create the National Heritage List, which has preserved many of them for future generations. But that same 1930s resident will be astonished by the radical changes to building use, an inevitable consequence of a transformed way of life. For example, many of the farms and many buildings that were village enterprises, such as smithies, have been sold and converted to residential properties. Those pubs that are still trading are now leisure destinations, designed primarily to attract customers from local towns or further afield for a meal. There are many drivers of this change, and among them are major changes in farming practice and economics, in the services and utilities available in rural locations, and in personal mobility, mainly through motorised personal transport. There were early signs of all of these around 1930, making it something of a tipping point, as can be observed in the detailing of Pendon's model scene. Finally, we hope you've enjoyed this series, that you've learned something new about the Vale of White Horse and about the 1930s, and that you are encouraged both to come out into the Vale and see for yourself, and of course to make a trip to Pendon Museum and explore and enjoy our models. Thank you for watching. We hope you have enjoyed this short video. We have a lot more from Pendon to share with you, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel, which we update regularly.